December 16th, 1944. Dawn was breaking over the Belgian countryside when Sergeant Hans Müller pressed his back against the frozen bark of an oak tree. Around him, his comrades from the 326th Volksgrenadier Division moved like ghosts through the Ardennes forest, their breath forming white clouds in the bitter cold. They had done this before, advanced under artillery fire, found cover, waited for the shells to pass. But something was wrong this morning, terribly wrong. The first salvo screamed overhead with the familiar whistle that every soldier knew by heart. Müller and his men instinctively dove for the snow-covered earth, waiting for the thunder of explosions against the forest floor. Instead, the world above them erupted in brilliant flashes of orange and white. The shells were detonating in the air. Steel fragments rained down through the pine boughs like deadly hail. The forest that had promised protection became a chamber of death. Men who had survived Stalingrad, who had crawled through the ruins of burning cities, suddenly found themselves defenseless against something they had never encountered. "The shells have eyes," gasped Private Steinberg, his uniform torn by shrapnel. "They know where we are." In the space of 3 minutes, Müller's platoon of 32 men was reduced to 7. The survivors huddled behind what remained of a stone wall, staring up at the canopy with the wide-eyed terror of men who no longer understood the rules of their own war. The artillery continued to fall, but it no longer struck the ground. It hung in the air like some malevolent intelligence, choosing the precise moment to unleash its fury. This was the morning that changed everything, not just for Müller and his shattered unit, but for the entire German army advancing through Belgium. They had expected to face American soldiers, young, tired, perhaps inexperienced. I had not expected to face American science. Hidden in the nose of every shell that burst above them was a secret that the Reich's brightest minds had dismissed as impossible. A tiny radar system, no larger than a coffee can, that could sense the perfect moment to kill. It was a weapon so closely guarded that its security rivaled the atomic bomb itself. The German offensive, launched with such ambition just hours before, was about to collide with the most revolutionary advancement in warfare since gunpowder. And in the frozen silence between the explosions, history was being rewritten one airburst at a time. 3 weeks earlier, in the depths of the Wolf's Lair, Adolf Hitler had stared at maps spread across a wooden table, his trembling finger tracing a line through the Ardennes. The Western Front had become a nightmare of static warfare since the breakout from Normandy. His armies bled men and material daily, while the Allies grew stronger. But here, in this quiet sector of Belgium, he saw salvation. "Wacht am Rhein," he whispered to his generals, "the watch on the Rhine." It would be his masterpiece, a sudden, crushing blow that would split the Allied armies and force them to the negotiating table. 200,000 of his finest troops assembled in secret beneath the winter fog. Tiger tanks, Panthers, the elite of the Waffen-SS, all pointed like a dagger at the heart of American confidence. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Strike through the Ardennes, seize the port of Antwerp, cut off British and Canadian forces to the north. With their supply lines severed, Montgomery's armies would wither. The Americans, shocked by the sudden reversal, would sue for peace. The Reich would survive. What Hitler didn't know was that buried in ammunition depots across the American rear, stacked in warehouses under armed guard, lay crates marked only with innocuous serial numbers. Inside those wooden boxes, wrapped in cotton batting, were shells that would decide the fate of his grand offensive before it truly began. The American intelligence failure was complete. Ultra-intercepts had gone silent. Reconnaissance flights had seen nothing through the winter clouds. The 106th Infantry Division, fresh from training camps in the States, was spread thin across the Ardennes, their positions marked by lonely farmhouses and crossroads. Many had never fired their weapons in anger. But even as German assault guns rolled forward through the pre-dawn darkness, even as paratroopers prepared read to drop behind American lines, a secret was stirring in the American ranks. Colonel Oscar Axelson, commanding the 406th Artillery Group near the town of Monschau, had received a shipment that would change the war. The crates bore no special markings. The shells inside looked ordinary, unremarkable, but hidden within their steel casings was the product of 3 years of American ingenuity, sacrifice, and an investment that had consumed more resources than any military program save the Manhattan Project itself. Hitler's gamble was about to meet American science, and the collision would echo through history. The telephone call came at 03:47 hours, crackling through static from the forward observation post. Lieutenant Colonel James Dugan's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "They're coming through in force, sir. The 38th Cavalry can't hold. We need everything you've got." Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson set down the receiver and walked to the window of his command post. Through the frost-covered glass, he could see the muzzle flashes of his 155-meter howitzers lighting up the pre-dawn darkness. His gunners were working frantically, loading shell after shell, but conventional high-explosive rounds weren't stopping the German advance. In his desk drawer lay a manila envelope marked Top Secret, Eyes Only. Inside were authorization codes for ammunition that officially didn't exist. For months, these special shells had been arriving at his depot under cover of darkness, each crate guarded like gold bullion. The standing orders were clear. Under no circumstances were they to be used without direct authorization from SHAEF headquarters. But SHAEF was 60 miles away, and the 38th Cavalry Squadron was dying. Axelson had served in the Great War, had seen what happened when good men died because of bureaucratic delays. He had watched entire regiments disappear into the mud of the Somme while staff officers debated ammunition requisitions. Not again. Not on his watch. "Sergeant Morrison," he called to his communications chief, "get me Battery A on the secure line." The response came immediately. "Battery A, Captain Reynolds speaking. Jim, I'm authorizing the use of the special ammunition. Load tubes 1 through 6 with VT rounds. Fire for effect on grid coordinates." Axelson paused, knowing that with these words he was either saving American lives or ending his own career. "Grid coordinates 847302. Danger close." The silence on the other end stretched for 10 seconds. Every artillery officer in the European theatre knew about the VT fuse, the proximity fuse that could detonate shells in the air with devastating precision. They also knew that its use was restricted to anti-aircraft roles only. Using it against ground targets without authorization was a court-martial offense. "Sir?" Reynolds's voice was steady but questioning. "Confirm authorization for VT rounds against ground targets?" "Confirmed. Lives are worth more than regulations, Captain. Fire when ready." What happened next would be studied in war colleges for decades to come. The first salvo of proximity-fused shells screamed over the German advance and detonated 30 feet above the forest floor. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Entire squads vanished in showers of steel fragments. Veterans who had survived the Eastern Front suddenly found themselves facing a weapon that rendered all their experience meaningless. The German advance stalled, then broke apart entirely. In the space of 15 minutes, Axelson's unauthorized decision had saved the 38th Cavalry and changed the nature of warfare forever. To understand what Colonel Axelson unleashed that December morning, we must journey back 3 years to a nondescript building in Silver Spring, Maryland. The sign outside read, "Tidy Motors, Used Cars." Inside, America's brightest minds were solving what many considered an impossible puzzle: how to put a brain inside a bullet. Dr. Merle Tuve pushed his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose and stared at the shattered remains of their latest prototype. The vacuum tube, no larger than a pencil eraser, had disintegrated under the tremendous acceleration of being fired from a howitzer. 20,000 times the force of gravity in a fraction of a second. Temperatures hot enough to melt copper. G-forces that would crush a man instantly. "It's like trying to design a wristwatch that can survive being hit by a locomotive," muttered his assistant, Dr. James Van Allen. Around them, the applied physics laboratory hummed with desperate activity. Drafting tables covered with circuit diagrams, women in lab coats testing thousands of tiny components, the scent of soldering flux and the quiet click of precision instruments. The challenge seemed insurmountable. How do you create a radar system that can fit inside a shell, survive the violence of being fired, and then function perfectly while spinning at 500 revolutions per second? The components had to be microscopic yet durable, sensitive enough to detect the ground rushing up below, yet immune to the electromagnetic chaos of the battlefield. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a glass capsule filled with mercury and designed to shatter on firing. When the shell left the gun barrel, the capsule broke, releasing the mercury to complete an electrical circuit. It was an on switch activated by violence itself. But the real genius lay in the miniaturization. Vacuum tubes that belonged in living room radios were shrunk to the size of small pills, 4 tubes per fuse, each one cushioned in a bed of wax and surrounded by felt padding. The radar transmitter weighed less than a pound, but could reach out 50 feet in all directions, constantly listening for the echo that meant fire now. By 1944, the production lines were running at full capacity. RCA factories in Camden, General Electric plants in Schenectady, Sylvania workshops in Massachusetts. More than 100 companies had joined what insiders called the most complex manufacturing program in human history. The workers, many of them young women, tested each of the 130 components that went into every fuse. They didn't know they were building radar sets. They thought they were making radio parts. The cost was staggering. Over $1 billion in 1940s money, more than the Manhattan Project spent in its first 3 years. But the result was revolutionary. A weapon that could think for itself, that could choose the perfect moment to strike. The proximity fuse didn't just make artillery more accurate, it made it intelligent. And on that frozen morning in the Ardennes, as German soldiers advanced through what they thought was protective forest cover, they were about to discover that the Americans had given their shells the power to hunt. The first reports reached German headquarters at 06:30 hours, carried by runners stumbling through the snow with wild eyes and incoherent stories. "The shells burst in the trees," gasped Obergefreiter Koch, his uniform shredded by shrapnel. "They know where we hide." General Major Friedrich Kittel dismissed the reports as battle shock. Soldiers under stress often imagined impossible things. But as the morning wore on, as radio contact was lost with battalion after battalion, the impossible became undeniable. The Americans had unleashed something unprecedented. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne found themselves surrounded but not defenseless. When German infantry attempted to storm their positions across the open fields, they met a curtain of steel falling from the sky. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, firing shells that burst precisely 20 feet above the snow, turned every advance into a massacre. Bodies lay scattered across the white landscape like broken dolls, testimony to the mathematical precision of American science. General Anthony McAuliffe, famous for his nuts reply to German surrender demands, watched the destruction from his command bunker with a mixture of awe and horror. "It's like God himself is reaching down to swat flies," he confided to his aide. The proximity fuse had transformed his surrounded paratroopers from desperate defenders into angels of mechanical death. Further east, at Elsenborn Ridge, the carnage reached epic proportions. The 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions, clinging to the high ground, called down fire on the advancing 6th SS Panzer Army. The shells burst above the German formations with clockwork precision, each airburst cutting down dozens of men. SS Oberführer Wilhelm Mohnke, watching his elite troops dissolve under the steel rain, radioed headquarters with a message that would be classified for 30 years. The SO. Enemy possesses weapons of supernatural accuracy. Request permission to withdraw. The psychology of warfare was shifting beneath their feet. German veterans, Men who had conquered Poland and France, who had fought house to house in Stalingrad, suddenly found themselves helpless against an enemy they couldn't see or understand. The proximity fuse didn't just kill, it terrorized. How do you take cover from shells that burst overhead? How do you advance when the air itself becomes hostile? At the Sauer River crossing, the demonstration reached its most clinical perfection. German troops, believing they were concealed by darkness and fog, attempted to ford the icy waters. American observers, equipped with infrared scopes, tracked their movement and called in precise coordinates. The shells arrived like clockwork, detonating 30 feet above the river surface. 702 German bodies were counted when dawn broke, an entire battalion erased in 12 minutes of scientifically directed slaughter. Even General George Patton, racing north with his Third Army to relieve Bastogne, was stunned by what he witnessed. "This isn't warfare," he wrote in his diary. "This is extermination by mathematics." His artillerymen, armed with proximity fuses, were averaging kill ratios that defied belief. Where conventional shells might wound or scatter enemy troops, these new rounds eliminated them entirely. The transformation was complete. Artillery, once relegated to supporting roles, had become the queen of the battlefield. But with this power came an unsettling realization. The killing was no longer done by men making split-second decisions. It was done by machines, by tiny radar sets that calculated the optimal moment of death with inhuman precision. The proximity fuse had made gods of gunners, but in doing so it had also removed the last vestiges of humanity from the act of killing. New Year's Day, 1945. Oberst Helmut Bennemann lifted his Focke-Wulf 190 off the frozen runway at Rainer Airfield as the first pale light of dawn touched the horizon. Around him, 870 German fighters climbed into the winter sky, the largest Luftwaffe operation in months. Operation Bodenplatte, the base plate, would be their last desperate gamble to regain control of the skies. The plan was audacious. Surprise attacks on Allied airfields across Belgium and Holland, destroy the enemy aircraft on the ground where they couldn't fight back. For once, German pilots would have the advantage of complete tactical surprise. The mission briefings had been encouraging, minimal anti-aircraft resistance expected, most Allied pilots still sleeping off their New Year's celebrations. The first wave struck just after sunrise. At Eindhoven, Spitfires burned on their dispersal areas. At Brussels-Evere, American P-47 Thunderbolts exploded in chains of orange flame. The surprise was total, the destruction impressive. German pilots, starved of victories for months, allowed themselves a moment of fierce joy as they turned for home. But the Americans were ready for their return. Every anti-aircraft battery from the Channel coast to the Rhine had been equipped with proximity fuses. Radar sets tracked the incoming German formations, while gunners loaded shells that would detonate with mathematical precision. The 90mm guns of the 7th Anti-Aircraft Brigade were no longer firing blind salvos into empty sky, they were launching guided death. Bennemann's formation approached the German lines at 1,200 feet when the first shells burst around them. But these weren't the familiar black puffs of conventional flak, dangerous only if you flew directly into them. These explosions followed the aircraft, detonating at exactly the right altitude, filling the air with lethal steel fragments. The Focke-Wulf beside Bennemann's simply disintegrated, its pilot never knowing what killed him. Another aircraft, streaming smoke, began a death spiral toward the forest below. Within minutes, the neat formation had become a scattered mob of desperate pilots diving for the deck, trying to escape the invisible intelligence that hunted them from below. Of the 172 German aircraft lost that morning, 127 were brought down by anti-aircraft fire guided by proximity fuses. The Luftwaffe, already bleeding from months of attrition, never recovered from this single blow. The Reich's Air Force, once the terror of Europe, had been methodically dissected by American technology in a matter of hours. The age of the manned fighter was ending, though few realized it yet. In its place came the age of the guided weapon, the thinking shell, the machine that could hunt and kill without human intervention. When the guns finally fell silent in late January 1945, Allied intelligence officers began the grim task of counting. The numbers they compiled would remain classified for decades, too sensitive for public consumption, too revealing of American technological superiority. But the statistics told a story that forever changed military thinking. 200,000 proximity-fused shells had been fired during the Battle of the Bulge. They represented less than 1/4 of all artillery ammunition expended, yet they accounted for more than 60% of German casualties. A single shell bursting in the air was statistically equivalent to 10 rounds impacting the ground. The mathematics of destruction had been revolutionized. Sergeant William Hayes of the 969th Field Artillery Battalion, an African-American unit whose contributions were long overlooked by history, kept meticulous records of their fire missions around Bastogne. December 23rd, 0800 hours, his logbook read. Fired 127 rounds, proximity fuse. German infantry battalion strength reduced from 400 to approximately 50 effective. No American casualties reported. The cold efficiency of the entries masked the human reality. Entire companies of young German soldiers, many barely 18 years old, erased in minutes by weapons they couldn't understand. The psychological impact was equally measurable. Wehrmacht prisoner interrogations, conducted by the 7th Psychological Warfare Division, revealed a consistent pattern of terror. "We called them the Devil's Shells," confessed Gefreiter Anton Müller of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division. "They followed us wherever we went, behind trees, in ditches, even in cellars. The explosions came from above, always from above." German Medical Corps reports, captured after the war, documented a new category of battlefield trauma. Soldiers who had never been physically wounded were found catatonic in aid stations, their minds broken by encounters with artillery that seemed to possess malevolent intelligence. Dr. Ernst Siebel, chief psychiatrist for Army Group B, wrote in his classified report, "The proximity fuse has induced a form of combat neurosis previously unknown to military medicine. Subjects display acute anxiety responses to any overhead noise, including friendly aircraft." But the numbers also revealed a moral complexity that troubled American commanders. The proximity fuse was so effective that it reduced the skill factor in warfare to nearly zero. A green lieutenant with 6 weeks of training could now direct fire missions with the precision of a master gunner. The weapon's very efficiency raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of modern combat. Colonel James Carey, Chief of Artillery for the First Army, summarized the dilemma in his post-battle report. "We have created a weapon so effective that it eliminates the human element from warfare. Our gunners no longer aim, they simply calculate. The shells do the rest. This represents either the ultimate expression of American industrial genius or the beginning of our moral abdication as warriors." The proximity fuse had won the battle, but in doing so, it had fundamentally altered the relationship between technology and humanity on the battlefield. In the decades that followed, as Europe rebuilt from its ruins and the world settled into an uneasy peace, the scientists who created the proximity fuse scattered to pursue new dreams. Dr. James Van Allen, who had solved the problem of miniaturizing vacuum tubes for artillery shells, turned his attention skyward. Using the same principles that guided shells to their targets, he designed instruments that would discover the radiation belts surrounding Earth that now bear his name. The factory workers who had assembled proximity fuses with microscopic precision found their skills in demand for a new industry: electronics. The quality control procedures developed for artillery shells became the foundation for manufacturing everything from transistor radios to early computers. The women of the Crosley Corporation, who had soldered circuits by candlelight during wartime blackouts, became the pioneers of Silicon Valley's first generation. But the weapon's true legacy lay deeper than individual careers or industrial applications. The proximity fuse had proven that intelligence could be embedded in machines, that decisions once made by human judgment could be delegated to electronic systems. It was the ancestor of every smart bomb, every guided missile, every drone that would follow. The moral questions raised in those frozen Belgian forests echoed through the decades. If a shell could choose when to detonate, what prevented a bomb from choosing its own target? The proximity fuse had crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. Warfare would never again be purely a contest between human wills. In the summer of 1969, as Neil Armstrong prepared to step onto the lunar surface, his spacecraft carried navigation systems descended directly from proximity fuse technology. The same miniaturization techniques, the same quality control procedures, the same philosophical acceptance of machines making life and death decisions. The moon landing was, in a very real sense, the proximity fuse's greatest triumph. Technology transcending human limitations to touch the infinite. But on quiet nights, in the villages of Belgium, where old men still remember the winter of 1944, the legacy remains more complex. They remember the day the sky itself became a weapon, and they wonder if humanity gained more than it lost when it taught machines to kill with such perfect, terrible precision.